Well, thank you very much, fellow Andrew, for your introduction. And this is essentially the launch of this book, which is appearing on Monday with Yale University Press. Andrew correctly gave the subtitle, which has changed since the making of this slide. The subtitle is indeed Crisis, Revolution, and America's Early Independence. I'd like to thank the Society of the Cincinnati. They fund a great many talks throughout the nation on the American Revolution. They have, in Virginia, for example, annual talks at places like the University of Richmond, the University VMI, Virginia Military Institute, where I've spoken. And it's worth drawing attention to the fact that they also have a magnificent library and archives here at the Anderson House, and that this is open to interested and serious inquiries and to members of the public. When I was a junior professor doing my first book, I was very impressed that the librarian of the Anderson House contacted me in the year, this was 2000, to ask me if they could be of any help and to invite me to use the collection. Now, this book I'm talking about this evening is a co-authored book with the late Trevor Bernard, who tragically passed away last April, but not before he had fully completed with me the manuscript, and we had submitted it April of 2024. He was a prolific scholar, one of the foremost historians of 18th century Jamaica, a pioneer in Atlantic history, a person of great integrity, moral courage, and intellectual independence. He never just followed the trends, and he was a very good friend who's been a great pleasure to work with. When he wrote with me the proposal to Yale, he liked to emphasize that we were both born outside the United States. He was born in New Zealand, and he spent most of his academic life in Britain, but he'd also taught in Australia. He was head of history at the University of Melbourne, and he'd also taught in Jamaica. He's very much an international figure who's responsible for encouraging the study of early American history in Europe and in Britain, and was a leading figure behind several organizations that promoted early American history. I was born in England, and he felt, therefore, the significance of this was that we both had an external view of America. We were looking from the outside, and that this is what is really the theme of this book. The book might have simply been called An Imperial History of the American Revolution. I like to describe it as Hamlet without the prince. It essentially says comparatively very little directly about America. This is not the place to find a description of the Boston Tea Party. It's about all the colonies that did not rebel, and there were 26 colonies just in the Western Atlantic, excluding India and Ireland, the Channel Islands, and places close to home, Senegambia, for example, in Western Africa. But what it does is look at those other parts of the empire and uses them to tell us something very different about the American Revolution, to give us a very different perspective and look at events through their eyes. And I've listed here five takeaways from what I call this imperial history approach. One is that it helps us to better understand British policy in America before 1776. Often when you look at British policies, they seem incoherent, disjointed. When you look at them in terms of the wider empire, you can see what the British are trying to do in America. But you also see, and we'll come back to this, that they legislate a great deal more for America than any part of the empire. In other words, they were quite obsessed about America in the 1760s, even though there were major issues in places like India and Ireland. And this should really demonstrate that Britain really was interested in America. You sometimes get historians making these offhand comments. The British didn't really care about America. It was a side affair. They fought one of the longest wars in their history to retain America. By looking at colonies that don't rebel, we can debate the causes of the American Revolution and even prioritize those causes. For my colleague Trevor, especially, some of the major themes of his earlier books was the centrality of slavery to the empire, the fact that most of these areas of empire, including both the northern and southern continents of the United States, were still under the control of indigenous peoples. We talk about settler colonialism as all part of a context to understand what is happening in America. The theme I'm going to talk about most today is the actual war, given the Society of Cincinnati and its interest in warfare, and how looking at the war through imperial and global eyes helps us to better understand why the British were defeated. And the final chapter is really about the impact of the American Revolution on the British Empire. There are 8 chapters altogether. These, I think, are highlights. We've got a chapter on the 7 Years' War. But the final chapter is on the impact of the American Revolution on the British Empire, and indeed the British Empire upon the new United States of America. One obvious connection, which is rarely made, is the founding of Australia and the loss of America, but I'll talk more about that later. This is virtually the first attempt to write an imperial history of the American Revolution, which is very surprising because imperial history was the first professional school of American historians in the early 20th century. We really associate it with Charles Andrews and the very beginnings at the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century of American historiography. And it reached essentially its last blast with this man, Lawrence Henry Gibson, who between 1936 and 1970 published 15 volumes of the British Empire and the coming of the American Revolution. It was part of a series, and in many ways, you would have expected that he would have covered everything we talk about in our book. But like all of the imperial historians, he stopped in 1776. He didn't go through the entire period of the American Revolution. It's a monument of scholarship in some ways, and rather remarkable as the work of one man. But in other ways, it's rather disappointing. There is almost no comparative analysis. So he's brought together this huge amount of material and great scholarship, but then proceeds to tell you about the development of each colony in isolation without really showing us how, by looking at these various colonies, how it would benefit you and it would help you better understand the period as a whole. I was disappointed because I was writing my first book on why the British Caribbean did not join the American Revolution. And I imagine that these 15 volumes, which do at least go to 1776, would help to explain why that happened. And in fact, there are one or two paragraphs on that subject. In other words, this was not a major consideration. Indeed, in 1957, Edmund Morgan at Yale, in an article called Revisions in Need of Revising, predicted that the imperial school would disappear. And that's exactly what happened after 1970. And it's only recently that it's reappeared. There is, though, one exception that comes very close to our idea. Richard Coupland at All Souls College at Oxford in 1930, he did a book called The American Revolution and the British Empire. But he did something that we tend to disparage in with modern historians, although they do it too often. He was very interested in applying history to modern politics, and indeed having history serve a political end. And his concern at the time was to help support what was known as the Balfour Declaration of 1930 and the Westminster Act of 1931. These were all policies designed to give the predominantly white countries in the British Empire almost complete self-government, known as New Dominion government, places like Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. And what Coupland was trying to do was to show that there was a very good historical basis for this, and that this represented a natural evolution of British policy, beginning with the Quebec Act. And he was very knowledgeable about Quebec. Interestingly, he had very little to say about India and those areas that clearly didn't suit his thesis. In 1997, T.H. Breen published a new article, and it was subtitled Revisions Once More in Need of Revising. It was essentially a riposte to Morgan. And what Breen said was there are some very interesting developments taking place in the way that the British understand their own history and the 18th century. And the new historiography really has importance for our understanding of the American Revolution. So this book really tries to take up that challenge. And indeed, he developed some of that himself in his book about the economic side of the American Revolution. Well, when I last spoke to Cincinnati, it was in 2016, and I gave the George Rogers Clark lectures. And those lectures, or it was a single lecture, was really the inception of this book. So I'm only going to briefly summarize those parts of the book that I covered in an earlier lecture. But I do want to show why this imperial approach really helps us understand the American Revolution. The two book covers here both relate to British policy before and during the American Revolution. One is Patrick Griffin about the Townsend brothers, Charles Townshend, who's famous in America for the first to introduce the tea duty and what were known as the Townshend duties, and his brother George, less well known, who was the head of the British government in Ireland. And the point that Patrick Griffin at Notre Dame was making in this book is that the brother in Ireland was pursuing very similar policies in Ireland to what his brother was pursuing in America. On the other side, you have Peter Marshall, P.J. Marshall, a marvelous book called The Making and Unmaking of India. And what Marshall does in that book is to show that what the British were doing in India was very similar to what they were doing in America. And the argument of the book is the British succeeded in India. They got what they wanted. They failed in America. But the point about both these books is that they both look at specific places and colonies, whereas our book is trying to synthesize them all. And we would argue that if you looked at Bermuda, if you looked at the provinces that ultimately became Canada and the British Caribbean, you would see similar patterns. And the reason that this helps us is that British policies otherwise look very disjointed, and indeed they were often passed to please particular interest groups and or to please, for example, the army, which wanted to have better quartering facilities in America. But if you look at the policies across the board, from the Caribbean to India to Quebec, you can see some common themes. One of those themes is the British interest in reform. A major theme is their interest in deriving a revenue. A third is in regulating the trade of America, improving the defenses of all of the colonies across the world, and increasing central control. Also, if you look at France and Spain in the same period, you can see they were doing exactly the same thing. One example is the Quebec Act, and I put this in as a cartoon illustrating it, because the Quebec Act was really not designed for the government of America, and yet it proved the final straw in British relations with America following the Coercive Acts. The East India Act actually reduced the duties on tea, and yet it sparked the Boston Tea Party. It was aimed much less at America than improving the finances of the East India Company. These policies also all have common origins. There'd been attempts since the late 17th century to strengthen British government in America. The most extreme was under James II, the so-called Dominion of New England, that essentially turned New England into a type of Spanish-style viceroyalty without assemblies. They have common origins in the Enlightenment. They were seen as progressive, trying to make policies more coherent. They have their origins in the increase in British nationalism, and this is where Breen felt British historiography was so important, that it is often the case when you have an empire break up that the mother country goes through an extreme period of nationalism, having been quite multicultural in the way it had governed its empire previously. And Colley notes that songs like Rule Britannia, God Save the Queen, these were all coming just before or during the French and Indian War. And you get this period after the French and Indian War, or what in Europe's called the 7 Years' War, of extreme jingoism in England in which the uh, various population of the empire was really looked down upon in popular images at the time. This is a period in which the British state is really strengthening in such a way that would really impress Alexander Hamilton. What Hamilton witnessed in um, Britain was the way they'd created a national bank, the way they were able to run a national debt, and the way they were able to fight France, a country much larger and a much more important military power, but to stay in credit and to have the world's largest navy. It was an incredible model for Hamilton of a way to fund basically a large war machine. This is a period in which Parliament in England is extending its powers and its pretensions. Parliament had been the main legislature for centuries, but what is changing is that Parliament starts to involve itself in every aspect of life. Domestically, it starts to pass a lot of domestic legislation. Previously, a lot of this was done by what's known as prerogative, orders in council, orders from the king. But suddenly, Parliament starts to legislate for the British Empire. And the 7 Years' War just accelerates this. So, what is the significance of all of this? Why does it matter seeing policies in a broader sense? Well, the imperial school, and many since them, including Andrew Roberts's recent book on George III, are often very dismissive of American claims of tyranny and mistreatment before the American Revolution. The imperial school was very fond of pointing out in the early 20th century that the tea tax was tiny and that this was really just basically conspiracy theory and rumor mongering about Britain. Our book argues that the complaints were not groundless, that there really was a change in the way the British governed America, and that Americans had every right to be fearful because they had no representation in Parliament, they were 3,000 miles away, and that any changes would create a precedent for future government. So you could say the American Revolution was really about the latent threat of tyranny. Because once you establish even a small tax that doesn't go through the assemblies and the representatives of people in America, it would be possible to create any number of taxes after that. Um, it was also justified because there was no constitution in America. There wasn't a deliberate plan of tyranny, but there was a very definite latent threat. I said I'd primarily talk about the war and um, in the Revolutionary War because we call this chapter the War of Empires. And we argue that this was more a war of empires than the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, because none of it really took place in mainland Europe. A very important part of the fighting during the French and Indian War was in Europe, and the British were able to use Frederick the Great to fight France in Europe while they fought France in America. There was nothing like this. And much of the war was between France, Holland, Spain, and the Maratha Empire in India, fighting for control of the British Empire and attempting to revenge the French and Indian War. My thinking about the war has evolved somewhat and changed. And it changed a lot with working on this book, The European Friends of the American Revolution, which came out shortly before the pandemic. It had originally been a conference at Mount Vernon funded by the Sons of the American Revolution, and we held it to celebrate the visit of the Hermione ship, the ship in which the Marquis de Lafayette sailed to America when it visited the east coast of America. And I'm quite proud of it because a lot of the scholars represented here work from Europe, and we translated all their work to make their work available to those interested in Europeans and military history for the first time. But what this made me think about was the importance of the foreign alliance, and especially the French in the American Revolution. And if you just study the national history of the Revolutionary War, you miss the fact that Britain was fighting four powers. And people, of course, forget the Maratha Empire in India, or the fact that the very last battle of the American Revolution was fought in India. And the importance of the foreign dimension of the war can best be illustrated by a very little known historical debate between two great historians of the Revolutionary War. And this debate's really gone under the radar for very good reason. Those sort of officers and gentlemen, both were former army officers and both were great friends, one British, one American, and they just playfully debated this in quite an obscure form, not in the major journals. But I would see it as perhaps the most important debate about the Revolutionary War and very relevant to understanding some current examples of warfare. So John Shai was for a long time, he died 2 or 3 years ago, but one of the best known historians of his generation of the Revolutionary War. Interestingly, he never did the big book about the Revolutionary War. Most of his influential work was in the form of articles which he brought together in this book, A People Numerous and Armed, first published in 1976. And then he republished it in about 1990. And the republication, he wrote a new introduction and was clearly quite bitter. And he acknowledged in his introduction that he was very much influenced by the Vietnam War, which had been the main war of his generation. And that essentially he saw Britain's problems in America as very similar to American problems in Vietnam, and that people would do well to study both. He was a sophisticated historian. He immediately defended himself, saying, I don't believe you should just see these wars as the same. Every war's different. But I just feel that what you're dealing with in Vietnam and in America is counterinsurgency warfare. And he saw, for example, the militia as playing a similar role to the Viet Cong in politicizing ordinary citizenry. I happen to be very much a fan of Shai and to agree with him. My only point would be that it'd be far easier to illustrate how Shai was right by studying the British side rather than the American. Now, the person he was debating was Piers Mackesy, who was at Oxford all his life. Both were military historians, something that's sadly neglected universities now. And Mackesy spent his entire life writing military history, but his big book called The War for America, which was also published in 1976, Like a People, Numerous and Armed, is really still the most outstanding book about the British side of the American Revolution, or outstanding in the sense that it's the most comprehensive in its coverage, almost like an encyclopedia. But it's so comprehensive and so detailed, it's over 500 pages in small print, that it's easy to lose the argument and not see the wood for the trees. I probably read it about 3 times. I always assumed that his argument was that the reason the British were defeated was because they were fighting across the globe and they were overstretched. And indeed, he set his book out like World War II, which was the war that most influenced him. But in actual fact, read it very carefully, and he is saying that the British could have won the Revolutionary War and blaming the generalship. It's poor generals that led to the British defeat. He said they were good tacticians and poor strategists. In other words, they were often very effective on the battlefield, but very poor in thinking in terms of a wider strategy. Now, the War for America was reissued about the time that Shai republished his book, and it was reissued largely at the instigation of Shai, who was a big admirer, and he thought this book was a classic. But he was also privately immensely critical and felt that Mackesy was misleading people about the war by making it look like the Second World War. And when he reissued Mackesy's book, he curiously put a new introduction on it in which he went into great length about Mackesy's background and his father. And when I first read this, I thought this is very odd because this was like private family scandal. Why would you put this in an introduction? And the private family scandal was that Mackesy's father was basically held responsible by Churchill at the beginning of World War II for the failure of the Norway campaign, in which Britain was trying to secure an early beachhead long before Normandy in Europe. And Mackesy made the decision as the commander of the Navy not to attack and felt that his situation was too precarious. So he not only lost his position as a result of this decision, but Churchill pursued it after the Second World War and wrote about it in his memoirs. And the family would probably have been virtually bankrupted had it not been for the fact that Mackesy's mother was a good writer and started producing popular books, and she held the family together. But for a military family, it was very embarrassing. And Mackesy spent most of his career switching blame and trying to vindicate commanders. The most famous one was about called The Coward of Minden, about Lord George Germain, who'd been accused of cowardice by the administration of George II, the man who later became responsible for overseeing the Revolutionary War in America. And Mackesy essentially used that book to try and completely vindicate him. And in the War for America, he's trying to vindicate politicians and shift the blame to the military. And Shai is gently saying it's more complicated than that. Shai even says the British military leaders were really quite good, The problem is the nature of counter-revolutionary and counterinsurgency warfare. And Mackesy shot back in a little article called Could the British Have Won the American Revolution? And if you can find it anywhere, it's a little typescript. It sometimes appears on Amazon. And in it, he says, of course, they could have won. They won in Malaysia. This is a war between 1948 and 1960. And many people in Britain at the time thought they would have been successful in Vietnam because they won this war in Malaysia. Oddly enough, Shai never took this example and showed why it was wrong. But since speaking here last and since writing on the British side of the revolution, I've done a lot of reading on British counterinsurgency warfare and specifically on Malaysia. And it was the worst example for Mackesy to choose because the point about Malaysia was that the rebels, who were a Chinese ethnic minority, had little domestic support, and even more crucially, they had no overseas support. You would have expected China or Russia to support them, as countries did. There was nothing equivalent of northern Vietnam. Even so, it was incredibly bloody, and it had to be ruthlessly put down. But this really highlights the importance of overseas support. That in most of these David versus Goliath conflicts, in most of these insurgents warfare where the small country defeats the large country, it is usually in association with an ally. That was true of Afghanistan, and it may prove true of Ukraine. And there are very few examples that I can think of a small country defeating a major country without a foreign ally. Ireland would probably be the best example, but the British eventually withdrew from Ireland. And in all cases, the big power is never really defeated. And you can't say that America was totally defeated in Vietnam or Britain in America during the revolution. They could have gone on if they wanted. I mean, their main forces were still intact elsewhere in the world, or the main British army was still intact in America. What changes is perspective. The major power is eventually worn down and doesn't see any purpose in continuing the war. They reevaluate the benefits of victory and indeed wonder if there is a path to victory. Opinion, if these are countries where opinion can make any difference, which was the case in Europe, opinion changes, and this changes to those in power. Lord North realized he couldn't hold majorities by early 1782, that Yorktown had changed the way the public viewed the war, and they would no longer believe in promises of victory. I'm not going to go through every theme that I've talked about because we are going to start running out of time, but I do want to give a few examples of the importance of foreign warfare. It's certainly the entry of the French in 1778, of the Spanish in 1779, and then of Holland at the end of 1780, did change the war for the British. They essentially became overextended throughout the world. This is a very early painting, the earliest, of Nelson, later Britain's leading naval hero. And it's supposed to represent Central America and St. John's River through Nicaragua. And the British devoted over 3,000 troops to that area. at a time, and to Jamaica at a time when they were not sending reinforcements to America. It was a fateful decision. Most of them died from disease. Um, they probably have benefited much more by sending them to New Orleans and to what was then um, West Florida. There was no reason why the British should not have retained their colonies in the very south, the Floridas and what becomes Louisiana and Mississippi. But they just felt that there was more opportunity and benefit in Central America. This is Ireland in the middle of the American Revolution, so they're also dealing with what looked like a domestic rebellion in Ireland. This is called the Volunteer Movement of 1780. The British, in order to retain Ireland, and this is where it's so important as to just how committed the great power is to retaining a country. In order to retain Ireland, it had a third of its peacetime army constantly stationing Ireland. And they had the biggest system of fortifications in Ireland of anywhere in Europe, other than possibly Potsdam and France. And this is why it's problematic. Could they really have ever held America against its will if they had needed that many troops? The British, of course, did defeat the French towards the end of the war at what's known as the Battle of the Saints in the Caribbean. The British always spelt it not French way, but literally like saints, they represented Sir George Rodney, who's the admiral commanding at the time, as the admiral, um, as basically Saint George killing the dragon. The significance of this is that if it had happened much earlier, it might have forced France out of the Revolutionary War. The editors of the Washington papers have just produced the final volumes of Washington's command during and just before Yorktown and just afterwards. And even the editors expressed to me amazement about how Washington was so depressed, and they feel it's worse than back in 1775 and at some of these great moments like Valley Forge. But it's understandable. The revolution was close to bankruptcy. What did France bring? What did others bring? One of the most important was money. And that's something that's been very little studied, although Larry Ferrero has recently done something to make up for that, and there have been some good global studies. The revolution would very likely have gone bankrupt without French and Dutch money and some money from Spain. Um, they also, of course, provided two of the world's largest navies. And this was the only time in the 18th century where the two navies of France and Spain outnumbered the British Navy. And the Battle of Chesapeake Capes was almost the only time that the British Navy was actually defeated in warfare. And that the British always had a smaller army. They never pretended to the strength of France on the field. They relied on allies. They had no allies during the American Revolution. Another theme I push is that all of this support starts well before the formal alliances. So Washington's army is getting support from France by early 1776, and it's critical support. America didn't produce saltpeter and the necessary sources for gunpowder. All of this had to be imported. A lot of the equipment and uniforms and clothing and necessaries, they relied on supplies from abroad. So I suppose what I've just changed in my thinking is the sheer importance. That is not to underestimate the importance of domestic support, of Washington's leadership, the role of the Continental Army and militia. Those were all essential, but they also relied on French money and French support. And it was clearly demonstrated at Yorktown, where all of these elements came together to surround and cut off the British. Thank you very much.
All right, so we will have a very brief Q&A session. If I could kindly ask, when you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring the mic, or my colleague will bring the mic to you. And please wait for the microphone so our friends on Zoom can hear us. So any questions, anyone?
Yes, I've heard it argued that if at the end of the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, if Britain had allowed the French to keep Canada, it would have tightened American loyalties to Britain, because they'd be, very fearful of the French and the Indians. I wonder what you think about that.
That was an argument made by Lawrence Henry Gibson in his 15 volumes. And there was a huge debate at the time whether to keep Canada or Guadeloupe. And Guadeloupe is a small island in the Caribbean, but it was worth a great deal more than Canada. So yes, it has a certain no, there's some truth in that. I'm not sure that it would have totally prevented an American Revolution, because I think British policies were the main instigation in the way the British changed their method of government in America.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Thank you. You mentioned one of the themes of British strategy being reform, presumably
Yes.
reform in its colonial regimes. Can you develop that just a bit?
Well, in the various reforms, for example, the customs service, it costs more to have customs officers in America than they received in revenue. So one of the reforms was to make the collection of revenue much more effective, and start using the Royal Navy to really force issues. And it leads to events like the Gaspé attack on a British cutter. And it didn't represent a new law. It was just trying to improve the method and streamline the method of British government. There was a sense in which the British had already lost America. To a large extent, the American provinces were, there was a tremendous amount of self-government. And it's interesting to see after the revolution that the British, far from becoming more liberal, especially in the wake of the French Revolution, in fact, going for much more authoritarian models of government. And Cornwallis was Governor General of India, and he actually had a friendship with some of the patriots in America, including Arthur Lee. And Arthur Lee wrote to him and said, "Isn't it about time that Muslims gain self-control?" And was all in favor of the self-liberation of these people. And Cornwallis replied, it would be centuries. And Cornwallis, interestingly, started to segregate the government of India so that the governing classes were white British, and the kind of elite moguls who played a big role in the 18th century and who William Dalrymple has written about, increasingly had very little involvement. And one of his big arguments was that Americans had been taught how to govern themselves, and that this would just inevitably lead to an independence movement.
Thanks for a great talk. Can you mention a little bit about the last battle of the Revolutionary War? You said was in India. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I think it's called Kandahar. There were several, three major naval battles with an admiral called Hughes at the end of the Revolutionary War, and a number of sieges, and they were indecisive, which really benefited the British because the French admiral, I think it was Suffren, was outstanding. And it's rather remarkable that the British didn't suffer a major defeat in India. And the result of that in the Battle of the Saints is that they were able to retain their, their empire, except, of course, for the American colonies. France really gained very little. Tobago in the Caribbean, retaining fishing rights in Miquelon and Saint-Pierre. But this bankrupted the French government, so France paid a huge price for its involvement. Probably the Spanish were some of the main beneficiaries, getting what's the equivalent today, much of the Louisiana territory, east and west Florida. The trouble was that Spain just wasn't a strong enough power by that point to be able to hold these gains that it made during the American Revolution. Yes. No.
So you mentioned the extreme vulnerability of the revolutionary effort in the 1780s due to finances and the like. Was Parliament aware of how acute the problem was, having had failed peace initiatives at the outset of the war and then the Carlisle Commission and so on? Was there any similar sort of initiative, or by that point had pretty much Parliament given up on a peaceful resolution of the war?
Well, Lord North very early recognized that it had been a huge error to use coercion. And so North sends out his conciliatory peace proposal. It's too little, too late, but he does it after he hears about the resolutions of Congress at the end of 1774. And those resolutions really told North that this was not a problem isolated to Massachusetts or to a small part of America, that all the colonies were acting in unison, that really worried him. On the other hand, he was caught, as like any modern political leader, by his own extremists. There was a group in his government called the Bedfords, who were followers of the Duke of Bedford, who'd been really the most staunch critics of America. They included the Earl of Hillsborough, who was a particularly hostile force in British government against America. So North couldn't concede too much. But by the middle of the war, he sends out the Carlisle Peace Commission, which you mentioned, in which basically he was willing to give up everything to reverse all policies passed by Britain since the French and Indian War. They were willing to agree to the continuance of Congress as a permanent body in America. It would have made America really like the modern Commonwealth countries, in which there was just this token British control, an acknowledgement. It was a face-saving formula. And essentially, for the second half of the war, the British were almost just fighting to save face. Of course, North really wanted to withdraw from the war much earlier. And George III was determined that Britain would cease to be a major power unless it continued with the war.
Dr. O'Shaughnessy, we do have a question from an online viewer.
Yeah.
You pretty much hit the nail on the head on the others, so wouldn't want to ask that. But one viewer would is referring to the image that you showed of Britain fighting the 4 or 5 powers, 4 powers, I think it was.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that they didn't have any allies. Is there a reason for that? And I guess the second part of the question was, at any point during the war, did they attempt to gain an ally?
The great question. The reason they had no allies was that they had succeeded so well in the French and Indian War that most Europeans concluded that Britain was a greater threat than France or anywhere else. And they also alienated their allies because there was a big peace movement towards the end of the French and Indian War, and political factions who just felt it had become too expensive, that the cost of the war was going to wreck Britain, and wanted to end it very quickly and not continue with an endless war. Whereas William Pitt wanted to continue and to take all really the French and Spanish possessions in the Caribbean. And by the end of the war, they'd taken Havana in Cuba. And George III, as a young king, and his ministers decided to end the war very precipitately. And this meant basically giving up Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great never forgave the British. But there are more important reasons, possibly, that really Europe became more concerned with Eastern Europe and the partition of Poland and issues in the East. Western Europe was no longer the battleground. So for them, Britain's need for allies in America was a distraction and irrelevance. They did, of course, they tried to get the Austrians to join them. They tried to persuade Spain and very nearly succeeded to stay out of the war. The stumbling block was Gibraltar. And Lord North wanted to give up that, but he realized it would be political suicide in England to get rid of Gibraltar. They particularly tried to court Catherine the Great, who was equally good at courting the English and pretending she was going to go along with this and giving us sense. I mean, there's a famous quote that 20,000 Russians in New York City would strike a good appearance in terms of intimidating the colonists, but they never, of course, came. The Russians would be more like the mercenaries coming, who we call the Hessians, but they came from all over Germany. But there are very few wars in which Britain's been so isolated. One historian recently said that is really the only other time was 1940, but in 1940, there was the Empire supporting Britain, places like Canada and Australia and so forth.
Thank you. And a few viewers would like for you to, I know we could go all night with this, but in a very short, concise manner, what is the biggest takeaway that you want the reader to gain from your book?
The benefits of looking at the American Revolution in an international perspective from abroad, that a lot of the themes, and I've really only dealt with 2 of those that discussed in the book, really help us to better understand many features of the American Revolution. I've talked today about British policy and why the British were defeated, why the Patriots won the Revolutionary War, but we can also use it to debate the causes of the American Revolution, which I've not touched upon, to see the centrality of slavery, even though it was largely in the Western Atlantic, economically, this was one of the most important practices and parts of the imperial economy, and also the big impact it has on the British Empire. Just as a teaser, the British had been sending prisoners to Georgia and even Pennsylvania, but especially Georgia and the South, a few to South Carolina. During the Revolutionary War, the people who were due to be sent abroad as a method of punishment were kept on what were known as hulks, old naval ships on the River Thames. And the British didn't know what to do with them as part of their transportation policy. The solution eventually was to send them to New South Wales and what became Australia, and obviously became, we often don't associate it with America, but that's one way that the American Revolution has a direct impact on other parts of the world.
Fantastic. I think that's a great place to wrap up. Dr. O'Shaughnessy, thank you so much for coming out and speaking for us tonight. Thank you all for joining us in person and for all of you joining virtually. For those of you here in person, we do have a limited, Yale University Press was very kind. They sent us a limited amount of books ahead of its release date, so get your advance copy right outside. And Dr. O'Shaughnessy is more than happy to sign them for you. So thank you again all, and for your continued support of our mission. Get home safe, everyone. We'll see you next time.